What we're going to be looking at here through all these sort of forays into the woods is what I call forest forensics. What we're going to be doing is it's like going into a crime scene and gleaning that for evidence to explain what actually happened in the past. And that's what we'll be doing in the exploration of these woodlands, going into forests and gleaning them for evidence that can tell us what their past history is. So, for example, we're going to be looking at the construction of stone wall, the shapes of trees, if there's scarring on trees, where the scarring occurs, growth forms of trees, the general lay of the land, the surface topography, and all these very common features we see out in our woodlands offer really rich evidence for unraveling very detailed history. So as you'll see, we can go into an area and not just tell if it was once open agricultural land, but we can pin down if it was previously crop field or hay field or pasture. We can determine when it was abandoned and go back to forest. With logging, we can look at an area and tell how many times it's logged, what was logged out. We can again date those logging activities. Same thing with wind. We can go into a forest and figure out if it's been disturbed by wind, what type of storms, whether they were thunderstorms or nor'easters or hurricanes. We can also date when those storms occurred. And the same thing with fire. We can interpret that evidence as well. There's a lot of evidence we'll be working with, but my hope is you'll find that it makes good sense in terms of exploring your region's forests. A stone wall like this one here is really iconic to central New England. And I define central New England as the northern and western half of Massachusetts, the bulk of Vermont, the bulk of New Hampshire, maybe excluding the very northern tier of those states, and the southwestern quarter of Maine. And all these walls date back to what's called the sheep fever period. The fever was a wool-growing mania that's been compared to a religious fanaticism, because it was sort of the first market-scale farming opportunity in the region of central New England. Before that, everyone had self-reliant farms where they grew enough food to serve their families, but they weren't market farms. So there were three things that ushered in sheep fever. The first is Napoleon going to war against Spain in 1806, and it might sound odd that a war in Europe has big impacts here, but the Spanish had developed a special breed of sheep called the Merino. And the Merino not only made a very ample fleece, but it made wool that made woolen textiles that were not scratchy at all. So if you have any smart wool clothing products, they're made out of Merino wool. Now, the Spanish were very smart because they liberally exported the wool around the world, but they had an embargo on the sheep itself. They didn't want anyone to get a hold of that breed and become a competitor. Well, it just happens in 1810, the ambassador to Portugal was a Vermonter named William Jarvis. And because of the war and the Spanish not being able to really keep their embargo in place, he was able to smuggle 4,000 sheep out of Spain through Portugal to be brought back to his farm in Wethersfield, Vermont. So now, as of 1810, we have Merino sheep here in central New England. 2 years later, we went to war with Britain, and one result of the War of 1812 is that tariffs went up on all imported woolens, giving anyone who could make woolen textiles here a huge market advantage. And then 2 years after that, the power loom was invented, which allowed mass industrial production of textiles. And with the water power coming out of these central New England hills, it vaulted this region, become really one of the major woolen textile producing regions in the world. Now, to give you an idea how dramatic the landscape changes are that come with sheep fever, in 1810, when Jarvis brings over his first 4,000 Merinos, only about 20% of the central New England landscape below 2,000 feet is open agricultural land. But in the next 35 years, as those 4,000 Merino sheep swell to 6 million, the landscape becomes almost 80% deforested below 2,000 feet in this region, the bulk of it in pasturage for sheep. So over half the area of central New England was clear-cut to make way for sheep pasture. Now, many people think that these stone fences were built as soon as farms were opened up, and that's not the case. Farmers much preferred wooden fencing. They could put up 10 times as much split-rail zigzag wooden fencing a day as they could stone fencing. It's only with the massive deforestation associated with sheep fever, there's no longer enough wood to make wood fencing anymore. And so farmers, as those wood fences start to rot away, have to go back to stone dumps and bring back the stone to make these stone fences. In central New England, it's estimated we have over 125,000 miles of woodland stone fencing. That means if we lined it all up, it'd wrap the equator 5 times, it would stretch more than halfway to the moon. I've calculated if we piled all this stone, it'd be 6 times as massive as all the pyramids in Egypt. And yet it was all done in just about 30 years. So if central New England was on the Mediterranean, these stone fences, I'm convinced, would be the 8th wonder of the world. Because it was all done in just about 30 years. But we're not, so it's just an intriguing part of our history that you see everywhere when you wander the forests of central New England. So one of the important things to do when interpreting forest histories is to look at the superficial topography of the ground. And that's why I'm stopped here, because out in front of me this way, there's the large mound, and then right over behind me in here is a depression. These are called either pits and mounds or pillows and cradles. What pillows and cradles are, they're evidence of a live tree falling over in the forest, either by wind throw or snow or ice loading. So there used to be a tree growing in here, probably about where that small white pine is, and wind coming from behind me blew the tree down that way. Its roots ripped up out of the ground, excavating this cradle. And then as the down tree and its upturned roots started rotting away, the earth that was within that root system eventually was deposited as the pillow. Now, if you stand on top of a pillow and you look over the cradle, you're looking in the direction the wind came from. In this case, the stone wall I was just talking about is running behind me over here, pretty much due east-west. That's west that way, that's east that way. So in this case, if I stood on the pillow and looked over the cradle, I'd be looking due west. That's signature of a thunderstorm. Most of our stand leveling winds, because of the high frequency, come from thunderstorm microbursts, and those are generated by front out of the west. A little bit later, we're going to see evidence of winds coming out of the east, which around here are usually associated with hurricanes, which happen on an average of maybe once every 130 years, with a magnitude large enough to knock down whole trees. Now, the thing about pillows and cradles is they last a long time. Big ones can be visible in a forest setting around here for up to 1,000 years. And because of our robust disturbance regime with all sorts of wind events and snow and ice loading events, after a few centuries, our woodland floors get carpeted in pillows and cradles. Now, there are some exceptions to that. On very dry, sandy, gravelly substrates, trees sometimes pop out of the ground and don't make large pillows and cradles. Up around Lake Champlain, we get what are called clay plain forests, where the substrate's clay and the roots of the trees are all very superficial. So if they go down, they don't excavate anything. That would be true of trees growing in saturated soils. And then on rocky ridgetops with very thin soils, you're not going to get noticeable pillows and cradles. But whenever we're in a woodland with glacial till soils around here, we're going to get them. So if you have them, what it means is you're either looking at a woodland that's always been forested. It was never opened up for agricultural purposes, or you're looking at a site that may have been previous pasture land. However, if you go to a site where you're on glacial till soils and the ground is smooth and even on the surface, even if it's sloping, then you're looking at areas where plowing removed the pillows and cradles. And if you look around here, you're going to see that there's no pillows and cradles or pits and mounds. The ground is very smooth on the surface. It is sloping a little bit behind me downward, but again, the key is the superficial features, which are very, very smooth. That means in a woodland setting like this area was plowed in the past, either as a crop field or as a hay field. And the plowing removed those pillows and cradles. That's why it looks smooth and even. Now, crop fields were plowed annually to make way for setting seeds. Hay fields, if they were well managed, weren't plowed as often. They're plowed a number of times at the start to get rid of the pillows and cradles because they'd get in the way of working a scythe. So the ground had to be smooth and even. But once it got there, if the hayfield was well maintained, it wouldn't be plowed that much. Because of the difference of plowing frequency, we get some other features that help us separate a hayfield from a crop field. But one thing I do want to point out first are the pines that are growing around me, particularly not this pine right here, but the pine that's next to it. If you look up about 7 feet up, you're going to see that the trunk forks into two trunks. A lot of the pines in this stand are doing that. And that's evidence that they've been impacted by the white pine weevil. The white pine weevil is a native insect that lays its eggs on the very upper terminal shoot of a white pine. But not any pine is going to do. It only seeks out trees that are generally less than 15 years of age and growing in full sunlight, because it wants to get a terminal shoot that's about as fat as a finger, maybe something about like that, because that's going to be the forage for its young. And older trees or trees growing in the shade, their terminal shoots are actually probably a bit more like that, and there's just not enough forage in them. The female lays its eggs in the upper terminal shoot of these young trees growing in full sunlight. And when those eggs hatch out, the larvae drill in and eat that terminal shoot, killing it. Which allows the tier of limbs below to erupt and grow up to become the new main trunks. When you walk into a woodland that has a whole array of weevil-hit pine trees, what it's telling you is that this is the very first cohort of trees that grew up in a once open site. And we can use them to date abandonment of former agricultural lands that have now grown up to woodland. Now, one of the beautiful things about pine, as we can see in this tree right here, is that every year they put on a tier of limbs. There's one right here, there's one right here, there's one right up there. These tiers of limbs are called limb whorls. So on a number of pine trees, if they're young enough, you can actually count how many limb whorls there are. And since they put only one on a year, that number is going to be equivalent to their age. If we did that around here on this site, we're going to find out that the trees, the older pines in here that are weevil hit, are around 37 years of age, indicating that in 1980, this was abandoned to grow up to forest. We're now at the lower edge of this very flat area that in 1980 was, I remember, a hayfield, but there's evidence to suggest that before that, it was a crop field. And that evidence is right in this stone dump here. So right here, we don't have a stone wall. We just have a place where a lot of stone has been dumped. And if I just look basically 6 feet away from me at the ground out that way, there's no rocks anywhere. You only see them here. But the critical thing about this stone dump is if we start looking at the rocks in here, we're going to find a lot of smaller rocks, about the size of a fist. And when you get a lot of small rocks, either in an adjacent stone wall or a stone dump like this, it means that the site abutting it was once cultivated to grow crops. Because cultivation is the only activity that both generates and then necessitates the removal of small stones. So if anyone has ever had a vegetable garden on glacial till soils up here in New England, they probably know every spring when they go out to turn their garden soils, there's a whole new group of rocks that they thought they maybe had picked them all out the year before. And people might think, well, what's happening? The rock's reproducing underground or something? And yet, we don't have to pick rocks out of our lawns. Rocks do not naturally surface out of the soil in forests, because any place that has roots of perennial plants like trees, shrubs, grasses, things like that, those roots hold everything in the soil together in a unit. So in the winter, when the ground freezes and expands, and then the thaw, when it settles again and thaws, rocks are held in place. But in a crop field like a vegetable garden that has no perennial roots, freeze and thaw cycles lift rocks to the surface. So one way to imagine it is think of a rock like this is sitting down in the ground. Winter is coming on. The frost is getting deeper and deeper and deeper in the ground, eventually gets down and latches onto the rock. The frost continues to develop deeper and the ground's expanding, so the rock is being lifted up a little bit. And what people don't realize is as the winter abates, the thaw does not go from the top down, it commences from the bottom up. Because around here, once we get down below the frost zone, we're into soil temperatures around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. There's an incredible heat reservoir down there. So as the winter abates, all of a sudden that heat starts radiating upward, thawing the ground. The pocket where that stone originally was thaws and settles, and when the rock is released, it can't quite make it back to its original starting point. In this way, on crop fields, stones are lifted up a small amount every year, and when they get to the surface, they get picked out. And then they're either going to be just dumped into a stone dump like this or incorporated into stone walls. As we get further east into eastern New Hampshire, eastern Massachusetts, a classic crop field wall or cultivation wall are two sets of large stones stacked up a few feet apart, and then the rest of the wall infilled with small rock. If you've ever seen anything like that, that's a classic crop field wall. Over in this part of New Hampshire, as we move over into western Massachusetts and Vermont, where there's not as much granite, the walls will just have the small rock intermixed with them. So originally, this was crop field, and then sometime transitioned into hayfield. And most of that happened around the time of the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, farmers had to grow all their own grain. And they're growing things like wheat, barley, rye, flax. And one of the surprising things about flax was not just grown for the grain, but the fiber in the stem, which made linens. And back during the sheep fever craze, research I did indicated it took 2 acres of flax to produce enough fiber for one twin bed sheep. So many farms had 10 to 15 acres just in flax. It was a lot of work. I mean, you think about having to plow all that acreage every year behind a farm animal, pick out the rocks, sow the seed, tend the crop, eventually sickle it down and winnow it out. But after the Civil War, rail starts linking up all these areas around New England. And now grain being grown out in the Midwest is being brought in by rail. Because of rail, that opened up market dairy farming. Because now real dairy farmers could get their milk products into urban centers very quickly. And right about then, farmers are saying, all this plowing for grain is such a huge amount of work. I think I'm just going to use my proceeds from my dairy money and buy the grain coming in from the Midwest and convert my crop fields into hayfields or pastures. And so most likely this conversion happened about then to hayfield. Behind me is the stone wall. That's the wall we first encountered when we entered the woodland here, and I talked about the sheep fever craze. On the far side of it is that flat area that we determined was originally crop field and then converted to hayfield and then abandoned. And so now we're on this side of the wall. We're going to interpret the history on this side, which is a bit different than the other side that was crop field, hayfield. So looking around here, the ground is not smooth and even on the surface. It's irregular. And this mossy mound right here is a pillow, and the area behind it where all the oak leaves are is a cradle. Then there's another mossy mound, which is another pillow, and behind it, again, a depression that's the cradle. There's a number more behind me here, over on this side as well, and they're all lined up in the exact same orientation. So this is definite evidence of a blowdown. If you get snow and ice loading taking down trees, they'll come down whatever way they're leaning. But when they're all on the exact same orientation, that's wind. So that stone wall behind me is running from west in that direction to east in that direction. And if I stand on the pillow and look over the cradle, I'm looking this way, which is to the southeast. That's where the wind came from. The only stand leveling winds we get out of the southeast are from hurricanes. So what we're looking at is a hurricane that hit this site and toppled a number of smaller trees. These are not real big pillows and cradles, they're smaller. Now, I can still see part of the trunk of this tree here, and right here are two parts of a limb whorl. So I'm looking at pretty small white pines that were blown down by a hurricane. The only hurricane in this area of Keene, New Hampshire, where we are today, that is struck in the tenure of these trees to still have their trunks here would be the hurricane of 1938. Now, town records tell us that right around 5 o'clock, the wind speed started increasing. They've been gusting all day, all afternoon long, around 50 miles an hour, enough to bring down some branches and twigs and things like that. But between 5 and 6, the eye wall of the hurricane of 38 hit this area. So I'm guessing we would not want to be standing here right around 5:30, because I'm guessing it within 5:30 p.m. on September 21st, 1938, we're within a half an hour of when these trees were toppled. Now, like I said, these pines were somewhat small at the time, and I'm guessing they're probably 20 to 25 years old when the hurricane hit. So this side of the fence that has pillows and cradles and lumpy ground of all different orientations, there's a huge array of just boulders over there on the surface, which would exclude haying or crop field. But then all these young pines coming in, this is indicative that this was a pasture, and a pasture probably abandoned sometime in the 19-teens. And that stone fence there was built to keep animals in this pasture from getting in that crop field. If that crop field didn't have a pasture abutting it, let's say this was a woodlot, there'd be absolutely no need to build a stone fence. But having that fence there tells us that that was built to keep animals from getting in the crop field. So this was pasture, probably originally sheep pasture. There is barbed wire on this wall. That indicates that probably around the time of the close of the Civil War, this transition to dairy pasture, because barbed wire is not good for sheep. In their heavy fleece, they can't feel the barbs. They can get tangled in it and injured. So now we've got our two areas, crop field that then transitioned to hayfield, pasture that was abandoned earlier than that hayfield was abandoned in 1980, and this abandonment happening in probably the 19-teens. Young pine coming in just the way they did on the other side, and then the hurricane of 38 coming and hitting the site. Now, the hurricane of 38 was a monster storm. At the time it struck, it was believed to be the most costly in terms of property damage of any storm in the world. And on its 70th anniversary, they computer modeled if that exact same storm had hit New England at that time, the estimated property damage was $125 billion. That would eclipse any hurricane we've ever had, including Katrina and ones like that. And one of the reasons was it was a massive storm. It made landfall as probably a Category 4 storm, and it was huge, and it did something that no previous hurricane had done. The Weather Service had predicted it was going to turn out to the Atlantic well below Long Island and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. It didn't do that. It came in over Long Island, hit the coast of New England, right at the Connecticut-Rhode Island border, then sliced to the northwest, coming up over the Pioneer Valley of the Connecticut River in Massachusetts, then up over the spine of the Green Mountains in Vermont, eventually exiting over Burlington and Lake Champlain, going into Quebec. It was still a full-fledged hurricane by the time it was going to Quebec. No one's ever seen a storm hold together that long over land. Out in front of me is, again, that flat area that was originally hayfield and crop field. Over to my right, I can see the stone wall that we've talked about. Beyond it, the abandoned pasture that has evidence of small pines being taken down by the 38 hurricane. And then in here, I'm on another stone dump at the edge of this former crop field. And again, small fist-sized rock in this stone dump. But what I want to point out here, if you look down to my left, there is no stone fence in here. This is just a stone dump. And what that's telling us is, if we have the crop field in front of me and no stone fence, then behind me is an area that was always left in woodland for a woodlot. If that had been pasture back there, and you might be able to see that it's irregular, pillowed and cradled, lots of rocks and stuff. If that had been pasture, you can bet there would have been a stone fence here. But the lack of the stone fence is saying there was no need to put all the labor into building a stone fence. The farmer could just dump the rocks here because they didn't need a fence here protecting this crop field from anything behind us, meaning that was woodlot. So in this one little area here, we have clear evidence of a crop field that at some point was converted into a hay field, probably shortly after the Civil War, and then abandoned in 1980 to grow back to forest. Across the stone wall was a pasture, probably abandoned in the 19-teens, that got colonized by white pine that got blown out by the hurricane of 38. And then on this side of this crop field, a woodlot that's always been forested and never had a wall needing to separate it from the crop field. We're in another section of the Goose Pond Preserve, and I'm standing in the cradle next to a very large pillow. So this pillow and cradle complex are really big, indicative of a big tree that fell down that way with winds coming out of this direction over here. So over here to my left, there's another stone fence going in that direction. It's running east. In that direction, it's running west. So if I stood on top of this pillow and looked over the cradle, I am looking this way, which means I'm now looking northeast. That's a different orientation than we saw with the hurricane of 38. Now, as you get closer to the coast of, let's say, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, you can get stand-leveling winds from two types of storms with winds coming out of the northeast. They could be hurricanes, or they could be nor'easters. But this far inland, nor'easters usually do not cause stand-leveling winds this far inland and away from the coast. So this is most likely evidence of a hurricane whose storm track was to the east of Keene, New Hampshire. The hurricane of 38, its storm track was to the west of Keene. So when hurricanes go to the west of an area, the winds come out of the southeastern quadrant. If they go to the east of an area, the winds come out of the northeastern quadrant. Now, along this pillow, there's this black birch behind me here, the bigger of the two black birches. And black birch has a progression to their bark. They start off pretty much smooth bark about the age of 50. Then they start getting vertical fissures in the bark, sometime after 50. By about 80 years, they start developing distinct rectangular bark plates. But by around 120 or more years, those rectangular bark plates start shedding. And I'm guessing this tree is probably around 110, 120 years of age, even though it's not very big. But it colonized on this pillow after this wind event. So that indicates that this wind event, whatever it was, happened well over 100 years ago. And for a pillow this big to form and have its root system rot away completely, could take 70 to 80 years. That combination is taking us back around 200 years. So I think what we're actually seeing here is evidence of the Great September Gale of 1815. The eye of that storm passed over Jaffrey and Hillsborough, New Hampshire, which is to our east, meaning the winds that hit this area would be out of the northeast. And maybe a demonstration of this would help. So for this demonstration, I'm going to use 5 sticks here to represent 5 different forests on an east-west transect across, let's say, New Hampshire into Vermont. So this stick here will represent a forest on sort of like the coast of New Hampshire, way east. This will be maybe central. This one could be Keene, where we are. And this one can be getting over into Vermont. And this one would be maybe western side of Vermont. Now, hurricanes have a counterclockwise flow. So this hurricane is just going to come right up, let's say, center right over Keene. It's going to be coming right over Keene like this. Remember, the hurricane of 38 came over the western side of Keene on this side. Hurricane of 1815 came on the eastern side. So here's the hurricane coming up. It's rotating counterclockwise, moving from the south to the north. And when it gets up to the point where it has stand-leveling winds, and it's going right over the center stick, the winds are going to come pretty much right out of the east, knocking that stick down, or that forest down to the west. Then as the storm gets up sort of getting over this transect, or getting up towards the transect. On this side, the eastern side of the storm, the winds are coming out of the southeast and dropping trees to the northwest. And on the western side of the storm, the winds are coming from the northeast, dropping trees to the southwest. And then, if the storm's big enough, these very outer forests, the winds are coming right out of the south, dropping trees to the north, and right out of the north, dropping trees to the south. So the eastern side, the winds are all coming out of the southeastern quadrant. The western side, they're all coming out of the northeastern quadrant. And again, this storm that made this pillow and cradle and a bunch, there's some big ones over here, were winds out of the northeast. We're too far inland for a nor'easter, so it has to be a hurricane that tracked to the east of Keene. So this site was on the western side of the track. And using that birch and the age for this pillow to form, I'm getting about 200 years. And if you subtract 200 from 2017, you're getting back right around 1815. So I'm fairly confident this is evidence of the Great September Gale of 1815, which was the previous really powerful hurricane to hit this region. Since pillows and cradles generated by live trees being knocked over in a forest can last up to a millennium, the only way we can date wind events using them is if we have one of two kinds of trees growing on them. The first kind of tree would be a small-seeded, shade-intolerant tree, sort of like a paper birch or an aspen. And that's what we have right here. There's a paper birch growing on a pillow here. Behind the tree is the cradle. And there's a number of pillows and cradles on this slope, all lined up in the exact same orientation. In fact, there's two I can see right down here that are nicely lined up with the cradle on this side and the pillow on the far side. They're all in the same orientation. In the past, I've stood on those pillows and cradles down there and taken a compass direction, because if you stand on a pillow and look over the cradle, you're looking directly into the way the wind came from. In this case, that is due west. So the wind came from due west. So this is a thunderstorm we're looking at. And now we can use this paper birch to estimate when that thunderstorm hit here and knocked down a number of trees. Now, paper birch is a tree that needs good light to grow in. It's not really bark photosynthetic, so its growth rates are pretty consistent. So a basic rule of thumb is that if a paper birch is about a foot in diameter, it's about 50 years old. If it's 2 feet in diameter, it's about a century old. This paper birch here is about 18 inches. And so it's probably right around 75 years old. It's starting to have its canopy closed in upon, so it might be a bit older than that now, might be 80 or so. And down at the base here, I can see some stilting of the roots. In other words, the roots are not all quite below ground. On this side, they raised up a bit. And also I can see in its trunk about maybe 10 to 15 feet up, the trunk on this birch is bowed. It's going like this, and then it bends back like this. So what that is telling me is that this paper birch germinated on the rotting remains of the down tree's roots just before they were completely gone. Maybe it was 5 or 10 years old when this whole root system of the down tree collapsed, and that caused this birch to be unsettled a bit. It tipped it, and then it had to correct its growth, growing back towards the gap dynamic. So it's probably about as tall as where that bend is. So based on the stilting of the roots, the base of this birch, which mean that it probably seeded into the tip-up of the down tree very close to the end of its decay period. So I'm guessing that probably this birch germinated on this decaying tip-up just before the pillow formed, probably about 30 years after the original tree was blown down. So that suggests that this thunderstorm, if we add the 75 to 80 was 30 to 40, that's suggesting this thunderstorm happened somewhere maybe 110 to 120 years ago. But only if we have a tree like this, or another tree we could use is a stilted rooted tree growing on a pillow whose roots sort of flare out like the delta of a river. Those are the only two trees we can really use for estimating the age of wind events.